Part of the fun of this effort to locate speakers for the professional lecture series is discovery of ideas, people, and access to both, sometimes in circuitous ways. This journey to locate Dr. Daniel Sayers, PhD in Historical Archaeology and Anthropology, began with an article called The Great Dismal Swamp in the February-March 2015 issue of the Nature Conservancy magazine. The article was written by Amy Crawford, who claimed not to be the researcher. She sent me to Dr. Brian Van Eerden, who is the director of the Conservancy's Southern Rivers Program based in Norfolk, Virginia. He then sent me in the direction of Dr. Sayers, who is an associate professor in historical archaeology, anthropology, and chair of the Department of Anthropology at American University in Washington. His area of research for the last 14 years or so has been the Great Dismal Swamp. Dr. Sayers is a Detroit, Michigan native who obtained both a BA and MA in 1995 and 1999 respectively from Western Michigan University in Kalamazoo. He completed his PhD in Historical Archaeology Anthropology from William and Mary in Williamsburg. According to Joanne Bowen, he received the first PhD in anthropology from that college. She reports that Dr. Sayers was a great student and won the full respect of the faculty. In 2008, he was given the Distinguished Dissertation in the Social Sciences Award from William and Mary. In 2013, he was also given the Distinguished Alumnus Award from the Department of Anthropology in Western Michigan University. Dr. Sayers has many interests, some of which are political economy, landscapes, alienation, diaspora and exile, Maroon communities, the Underground Railroad, labor transients, defiance and resistance. He's got more than we know. Hobos, the Great Depression, Marxian existentialist perspectives, community systems and structure, race, racism, racialization, historical anthropology as social justice and world transformational praxis, and much, much more. The amazement is his broad interests. He is the author of a number of articles and book chapters covering various subjects relating to his interest in archaeology. From 2010 to 2013, he received a collaborative research grant to study the Great Dismal Swamp and published a book in 2014 called A Desolate Place for a Defiant People, The Archaeology of Maroons, Indigenous Americans, and Enslaved Laborers in the Great Dismal Swamp. Dr. Sayers currently resides in Baltimore, Maryland, where he writes fiction, dreads the weekly commutes to DC, and pays the mortgage and bills in his spare time. That's his quote. Let us welcome Dr. Sayers as he presents this evening A New Society in an Ancient Swamp, the Social World of the Great Dismal Swamp, 1607 to 1863. Welcome.
Thank you.
Yes.
Well, thank you all for joining me today to hear a little bit about the Dismal Swamp. Yes, we're going to be speaking here of what I'm arguing is essentially a new kind of society that emerged right around the time Jamestown was first settled, and it intensified, it grew, it expanded, it did the kinds of things human social worlds do. It changed even up to about emancipation is that period that we're going to be covering, at least in general, and then in some specifics. Do I have a clicker?
It's over there.
Ah, yes.
You need to turn it on this side.
There we go. Good, thank you. So I'm going to try to cover some ground here. Hopefully I won't run too long for everyone's attention, but I will probably be skipping over a few slides here somewhat quickly. If I do that and something you're interested in, please, when we have a chance to talk with question and answers, I can go back to those slides and explain in more detail. But effectively, you can see the main categories or areas anyway that I hope we can kind of cover a little bit today. The present day swamp and social history. Very briefly, the research background of this project, and then of course the methods and some of our finds. And then a general conversation and then some specifics about some of the interpretations that we or I've been able to pull from the data, the information we have, and then of course, at least some discussion of why does it matter, right? What can this do, this work, this understanding of these people and our knowledge of them in terms of our future individually or even more broadly. Okay, so just in case it's an unfamiliar place for some, right, if you note the star there, that's what we're talking about in terms of where the Great Dismal Swamp is located. We're talking about eastern Virginia and southeastern Virginia, northeastern North Carolina, between the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay and the Albemarle Sound. This is familiar country. A little more close up, this is about where that star was. Okay, I think that's the right one. No, this. All right, so in the green here, we're talking, that is the current U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's Great Dismal Swamp National Wildlife Refuge. I will be talking about it as the refuge to avoid that mouthful every time I mention it. But if you notice the black outline, that's the more or less the original extent of the Great Dismal Swamp prior to the Civil War, going back to 1607, and then of course even before that. This is a Fish and Wildlife Service map, relatively recent. Okay, you can see the canals are in color, these colored lines. There's a little bit of property boundary coloring going on there, but the red ones in particular are of interest to the project, as is the Cross Canal, down here. Okay, so the current refuge is about 190 square miles in size, and that's about 10% of the original swamp size that I outlined there in the previous slide. So basically, the current refuge, the focus of the refuge has been, at least until the start of this project in the last 15 years or so, largely it was a focus on, like most refuges, right? The sort of landscape itself is a natural landscape. So the trees, the beasts, the bugs, the water itself, the swamp itself, these were sort of the main foci of the refuge's sort of stewarding mission. And I'm sort of pleased to report that in the last 15 years with this work that's been going on, in terms of archaeology, looking at the refuge not as just a natural resource or a natural landscape, but rather as very much a cultural one. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has increasingly come to understand that, right? They're seeing it now as a natural as well as cultural landscape with natural and cultural resources that are worthy of preservation and so on. So it's pretty cool in that regard. Some facts about that environment before we jump into the social history. The original swamp was mostly Atlantic white cedar and cypress. All right, that was the predominant tree species back before the Civil War. Currently, it is a real strong mix, a wide variety of trees. There are still some Atlantic white cedar and cypress, but we have dozens and dozens more species that have come about because of, depending on where you're talking about in the refuge, hundreds of years of logging. All right. So they say that this current refuge, that's about 190 square miles, in its entirety has been fully logged 3 times over, if that makes sense. So not all at once, but total 3 times. So there's been a lot of disturbance in that regard. The canals themselves, in the current refuge, is quite a few. The ones in red that I showed, at least most of those are pre-Civil War canals. Okay? But after the Civil War, they were still digging the canals. A lot of them you might just call ditches, depending on your mood, right? But there's a lot that course throughout that refuge. And that ends up being one of the main ways of accessing and traveling through the swamp for us in modern vehicles, at least until you can't access where you want to go on those roads alongside those canals. So boats do not go through the swamp much. They go to the lake that's in the middle, Lake Drummond. But even then, I wouldn't call it high volume or high traffic as far as boating goes. The refuge itself being a refuge, access to the public is somewhat limited compared to, say, a national park, right? There are places you can go as a member or a resident of the area or the public, but it's stewarded very, very conservatively. They don't let people just wander willy-nilly through there doing as they please. Not to say that people don't, but they try to keep an eye on that and keep things under control as far as human invasion, so to speak, of those natural and cultural resources. So, besides that, I think we'll press on into this. I can answer any more questions about the current landscape toward the end. Right there. Okay, so I throw this up because I want to give you some of the language. It's used even before the Civil War. This happened to be 1838, but it stands in for many kinds of quotes you'll see going back into the 1700s, just by various observers. Okay, so the language here, referring to the Dismal Swamp, right? It's a blasted region. Nothing lives or moves. Right? It has this lonesome solitude. Sunbeams sicken and grow pale as they glide like ghosts. It's impossible that human industry or human wayfaring could ever penetrate it. No wholesome growth. It has slimy depths. Right? It's a wild jungle. It's rattling cover for venomous reptiles. I don't know why I just said reptiles. I always say reptiles. All right, black ponds, and it is a place forbid. We should kind of remember all of that, but that place forbid is kind of important for the kind of view I have, or my understanding of the swamp and the social history. When we think about it, again, I'm going to try to be brief on many of these points, but there's this deep tradition among sort of people of European background, right, that these sort of untamed forests, jungly places, as they might call them, swamps, right, that they're a place to fear, they're a place to loathe, right? And if anything, in the positive, I guess, they would look at it as places to transform into something you can control. All right? So whether it's some deep dark forest somewhere that's several thousand acres and finally ends up being controlled by the way of lumbering, right? Or some kind of development, right? Prior to any of that kind of transformation of these landscapes, at least when we're dealing with people of many European backgrounds, right? There's this deeper cultural sense or both set of beliefs that these places are just kind of places to fear. Okay? And that sort of a place forbid evokes that kind of idea to me. Again, this is not unique to Francis Kimball. This is seen throughout many of the discussions of the swamp and similar landscapes, right? Throughout the centuries prior to the Civil War. But it turns out, of course, that not everyone has that view. Not everyone understands swamps that way. And in fact, there are many ways to understand them, interpret them, to come to know them. Okay? And throughout that 1607 to 1860 period, right, we've come to find out and explore the ways that many groups, really, ended up coming to appreciate the swamp. Okay? In part, they used that general outside attitude, right, found among the slavocracy, the enslavers, people of Euro backgrounds. These people used that against them in a sense, right? They used that as a tool for their resistance, okay? Because of that fear, if you went in the swamp, guess what? The people who are afraid of it and loathe it and think that it's full of ghosts and other phenomena like that, right? They're going to be much more hesitant to come after you. It's pretty simple, okay? So here in the 1607 to 1680 range, okay, we understand that the colonial sort of usurpation of their lands, traditional homelands, right, began very early with the settlement of Jamestown. Okay, and so an unknown number of Native or Indigenous Americans came into the swamp permanently, right, claiming it as their own, or it was already part of their cultural landscape, equally as likely. One such tribe may be the remnants of the Chesapeake tribe, very early in that period, but others as well along that 80 or 70-year stretch. Okay, a lot of folks were living along the edges of that swamp, natural edges. On the one hand, we get it. One side is swamp. What was the other side, right? Well, continuously that world is coming to be defining itself in terms of the look of it, with the houses, with the plantations, with the farms, with the furrowed fields, right? Transforming what was once swamp and woods and everything else into these fairly controlled places. So suddenly that swamp stands out in marked contrast as this modern era continues at pace after the settlement of Jamestown. Okay, around 1660 to 80 is when the sort of cementation, right, of the race-based slavery system occurs in that region. Okay, and it's really at that moment, or those moments, that we expect, right, a sudden wave of people who are known as African American Maroons or Maroons, right, to have gone in the swamp. So Maroons, in short, were people who, in the vernacular, might say they're permanent runaways from slavery. Okay, I could say that they self-extricate themselves from that enslaving world, right, and go to these places like the swamp, right, to permanently live and take control of their lives. And again, some of the detail, not as important today, but we have them living in various places in that 2,000 square mile swamp. Okay? And when we get to about 1800 is when we see a major period of change. And this is when finally the investors of the outside world, those people that if they can't sort of join the landscape and live in it and so on, they want to transform it, they want to develop it. Okay? In this case, it takes the form of canal and lumber companies that form. They finally figure out a way to invest the capital in the right way. The labor system's now in place, right? Enslaving people, putting them to work in the swamp to dig the canals, which then facilitate the lumbering and the moving of the lumber products out of the swamp, right? And start to claim it really as sort of a profit-making enterprise in place. Okay? Fairly straightforward. Well, in that process, they bring in these enslaved workers, okay, and they live along these canals, these pre-Civil War canals from our point of view, and they're forming settlements or communities. Okay? So all in all, right, at least three main groups that we can talk about across this long 200 almost 60 years. Okay? We have Indigenous or Native Americans and Maroons and then enslaved company workers. In this world, the social world that comes out of these influxes of populations, however permanent or impermanent in the case of some company workers, right, it becomes quite interesting. Okay? So the Dismal Swamp folks, the diasporans, all the groups of people that I mentioned there in the previous, right, how are we finding information about them in the documents? Okay? Well, a lot of it is questionable. I'll say that up front. A lot of the documentation, as a scholar, even as just sort of a skeptical person, you might have some doubts about how accurate the reporting was, or whatever you want to call it, reporting, or just the information in them is. Maroon, Osmond here observed in the late antebellum period. He could very easily be the figment of the writer's imagination, as I've argued elsewhere. It's probably the right idea. Maroons probably looked something like that. They did live in the dark fens of the swamp, as they said, right? But in his case, I think, right, his excitement got the best of him after he took a pretty easy trip up and down one of the canals in the 1854 to 5 range. Here you have a painter somewhere in the United States, heard about Maroons of the Dismal, who were pretty consistent sources of conversation by then, right? Painting what he imagines, right, as a small group or family living in the swamp. But on more solid ground, okay, this is a very rare bit of evidence. Very rare in the documents. Okay? So here we have a discussion of how this Maroon ran away from his master and lived by himself in the desert. That was one of the names for the Dismal back then. About 13 years. For about 13 years. He comes out 2 years ago. He raised rice and other grains and made chairs, tables, and musical instruments. There's a lot of detail in that. A lot of detail. Considering that other sources, what we get from them is, oh, there might be several thousand Maroons in the swamp. Oh, okay, that's good to know, right? But not a lot of detail about what they were doing out there. In this case, right, seems like a fairly legitimate source. I won't get into the details, but it comes from people who might know and hear stories about Maroons and others in the swamp. These were some investors in the swamp. Okay, it seems to be somewhere between 1775 and 1805 that this was written. Okay, but I want to point out a few things because we do want to explore a little bit about what the social world looked like. Where am I at? Okay, lived by himself. Now we know Maroons across the hemisphere, when they existed as communities and settlements and even larger social groups or agglomerations, privacy or secrecy was important. Anonymity. They didn't just go around necessarily announcing who they were. And they were committed to life in the swamp. Something brought this person out, And I'm guessing it's the British Emancipation Proclamation. Okay, but what he did not do was come out and tell these Euro-American slaver loyalists, right, that, oh yeah, I came from a huge community out there. Go find him, trust me, you'll find it interesting. No, he says he lives by himself, right, but here we go. He's raising grains and rice, he's making musical instruments, right, everything's in the plural here. And so what this points to, furniture, right, how many chairs do you need to make if you're living by yourself, right? And subsistence, they're making growing grains, right? I'll come back to that, fear not. Same author who drew the picture, or the story that gave us the picture of Osmond, gave us this picture of one of the enslaved labor company camps. This is in the Virginia part along one of the more famous canals, not the most, but one of them, Jericho Ditch. Okay, very sort of swamp looking. And here you've all seen, I imagine, or most have seen, runaway slave advertisements in newspapers. Maybe not the originals, but okay, well, this is very detailed, even compared to those that you typically see. Okay, it turns out that what we have here, right, is this registration. So after 1847, when companies were bringing in slave workers into the swamp to live in those settlements along canals, they had to record them in the county, in whatever county they were working in, record them in the county courthouse. Why do you think that? Why do you think they were caring about recording their every feature? Look at that. A small scar in the inner corner of the upper eyelid of the right eye. Right? A lot of detail. Closest thing to a fingerprint. Well, right, they were worried about these folks being brought in to work and then, of course, turning around the next moment and marooning. So the idea here was describe them so at least if we find them out there, we'll have a very, very good understanding of who we're looking at if we happen to see one of these folks that might run away. But I also pointed out, because look at the scars, look at the way this person's described. This is that outside world for a lot of people, right? The body becomes, right, this sort of almost photograph, right, of all the things that happen to you, or many things that happen to you across your lifetime. Scars, teeth, right? And so when we think about why people are going into this swamp, I'm not saying this explains it all, but this kind of thing, right? The life of this sort of brutality and the racism that I think we're all familiar with today, but certainly in the world of the enslaved folks before the Civil War, right? We have to keep that in mind. It's not just merely a backstory to why people would commit to life in the swamp, whether it's as a maroon or as a long-term company worker. Okay? That's the story. The outside world had many oppressions and problems, right, as far as many people were concerned who had to live in it. And what you're seeing here is a social world that emerges from a group of people who had been in that outside world, right, who take advantage, like I said, of the beliefs about swamps, transform it into their own landscape and their own place to take control of their lives, their families, their sexuality, right, their labor, and really everything about life that we care about for the most part, if not for sure all of it. Okay, so beyond that, the documents aren't telling us a lot. They really aren't. I did a good amount of archival work as a historical archaeologist. We do that, much like the historian. We have a lot of general ideas, like I said. There's 3 or 5 or 50,000 Maroons out there. 1852, 1820, whatever it may be, right? But not a lot of info. And in fact, most info we have comes from, not surprisingly, the canal era, the canal company era. Once companies are investing money in a place, capital, etc., right? Funny how documentation multiplies infinitely, right? They're keeping track of workers' laws change, right? Because the workers are now owned, they're rented, whatever the situation may be. We have to keep track of them. The whole thing kind of happens and evolves around this use of the swamp by people, diaspora and Hunot. Okay, so we don't have a lot to go on, and like I said, that one document, that's a lot of detail for what we're dealing with here. Okay, it doesn't tell us by any means everything we want to know, of course not. So that's one of the helpful things about archaeology, or useful things is probably what I mean. Okay, it's a different way of accessing these pasts. I'm sure you've all thought that one way or another when you've read about archaeological work, right? But it really, at least to me, comes to life, right, with this project, with this particular history, with these people. So, all right, so I started the Great Dismal Swamp Landscape Study, with that nifty little acronym for it, 2001. So for a couple years I did that archival work and some interviews. And then around 2003, as you'll see in this monotonous phasing graph or chart or list, whatever, is when I started doing the field work for my doctoral dissertation. So I spent a total of 24 months and 3 years doing field work in that National Wildlife Refuge. I finished up in 2008, went to American University, and then ran 5 summer field schools in a row from 2009, my first summer there, to 2013. And then there's some of the other things that went on since going to AU. Okay, prior to the Great Dismal, this project, okay, no archaeological work to speak of had been done in the refuge, right? Which is unusual for a federal property, by the way. Mainly, I think it's the case because it was a swamp. People thought, what human history that mattered went on out there. Right? So there was no federal sort of architectures that were in place that required surveys and accounting of the cultural resources at the refuge, and so no one knew, right? The one site that was recorded on the edge, and it was from the 1880s or later, so not particularly relevant here. But it turns out even more equally important, perhaps, in U.S. historical archaeology, right, very little to say pretty much no work on these kinds of resistance communities, diaspora communities, has occurred in remote locations like the swamp. Okay? So all that's a way of saying I didn't have a lot to work with. As an archaeologist, you need more than that usually, or I should say, I'll show you don't need more than that, but you'd like more than that. Okay? So, very briefly, okay? And it develops a predictive model. This is sort of think of it as a very complex, multi-layered hypothesis that puts it in some kind of perspective. The idea here is, okay, I can't tell you that so-and-so found this and that at these sites that are very similar. So I expect to find those kinds of things. I had to go through and figure out basically where were these people living, right? Where in the swamp? And then what would they have used? What would they have made? What were their daily kinds of things that they created and crafted? What would they have looked like in bed? And then, when I actually find sites, compare what I find to what I predicted, and then go from there. Okay, so one thing I did suggest very early, right, was there's at least 3 main areas to this swamp. We have the canals from the pre-Civil War period or antebellum. We have the swamp interior, which is about 95% of it. Okay, I would call interior. And then you have this sort of idea of an edge or a perimeter of the swamp. And that, to me, based on everything I know, is about consider a half mile or less, right, of going into the swamp before you're starting to get into interior. Okay, so most of that original swamp would have been interior by at least my sort of predicted model. But where was I looking? I'm looking for dry ground, basically. Islands, hills, hummocks, as they used to say. Okay? And that the idea there was people could have lived anywhere. People are creative. But if there is dry ground out there, people will have found it and they will have gone with it. Okay? So on the one hand, I could dig in all that peat and muck that's out in the swamp and hope I find some old posts. Yeah, right? At least go to something dry and see if there's a concentration, right, of human artifacts and sites and so on. Okay, so I don't have a heck of a lot of photos of the environment, but it is a swamp. But it is not quite the same as some of the more famous ones like the Okefenokee, the ones you can take the old fantail boat through, you know, there's 40 feet between trees and gators plopping in and all that. It's not quite that. Much like even before the canal period, right, it's a very thick swamp, right? Not only are trees much closer together, they always have been, right? But you have the vines, you have this very thick understory, right, which this sort of captures. That's not atypical. not atypical. All right, for the swamp. And that's in the fall, that photo. So you gotta imagine these trees with the green canopies. Excuse me so much. That's why I get a dry spot in my throat. I just have to work out. But still, our descriptions from before the Civil War, this is very much evocative of those descriptions of what people had to get through if they were going to go into the swamp and work or maroon or anything else. Okay? Some more typical views, especially to the left. The lake, in a sense, is atypical. It's a lake, but only one lake in the swamp. But it's a big one. Second largest, or one of the two only natural lakes in Virginia. Here's another good view of the swamp interior. A little less thick, but it turns out that that's a path that people have been using, namely us, as well as bears and deer and so on, so it's a little thinned out, nothing else because of traffic. But lo and behold, sure enough, we did find islands. We did find hills. Okay? Now again, these were not archaeologically known, but it turns out that the ecologists, the naturalists, right, who worked in the refuge or know about it from before even the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service took over, they've known about these islands and hills out there for some time. So all it took was enough good fortune for somebody to finally listen to what I was looking for among those that knew about these islands. And they finally directed me to a few down in the North Carolina part of the refuge, and the project, of course, benefited greatly from that instruction. But as you can see, right, these are views of those islands. Doesn't look much different than your typical forest. Walking through fallen trees, fallen logs. Again, most of these upper ones in the summer, but the other two are from fall and winter. So Archaeological Survey, well, I just mentioned to folks at dinner that I started this project in the field anyway. It was not long, maybe 4 weeks after Hurricane Isabel came through in 2003. And it turned out that Isabel's path went right over the refuge. And it turned out that it decided it wanted to knock a lot of trees down out there. So it made survey kind of a pain. Walking over fallen trees, over 5-10 feet of water and muck. Accidents did happen, soakers, etc. But on the islands, well, those trees stand up a little taller than the surrounding landscape. And that hurricane really impacted the trees on islands, at least several of them. So a lot of them were knocked over, and then a month later we come through, or 2 months or 3, right? And what we're seeing now is that whole wall of dirt and roots from where the tree fell over. And it turns out it helps us, it exposes artifacts and other things of interest. And it helps us quite a bit very early determine where people were living, what kinds of artifacts we're seeing out there are typical, and then even some understanding of the natural soil layers. So up here, just for an example, quickly, all right, this is about a 4,000-year-old artifact in place, not disturbed soil. It's a soapstone or steatite vessel fragment with good size. Those are centimeters. Okay, so pretty good size. We found several pieces of that vessel. And again, photos are just doing the survey. We have some pretty tall ones, 18-foot tall tree falls. So I want to give you a quick visual, okay, of the potential for islands just in the refuge. Okay, this is the outline of the refuge, and I guess the state park down there in North Carolina State Park as well. Anything you see in color, minus a few of these odd splotchy things, which are artifacts of the methods used to get the data. Right, a lot of those smaller marks are very likely, if not definite, islands. You see a big clustering of them around the lake. Okay, and all along here and so on and so forth. Okay. The red ones that I've circled and have letters next to, these are ones that we found. These are ones that, independent actually, the student that did this for us, they had no idea where we found islands or not. So the red ones in his map, very probable or very probable islands. It turns out, at least in the cases that we know of, he was pretty much spot on. So, meanwhile, more recently, some doctoral students have found some up here, including the red ones up there. So in any case, right, there's a lot of islands out here potentially. And this is 10% of that original swamp. Okay? So if we kind of extrapolate, right, do this sort of, even if you call the lake an anomaly, but 10 times this number of islands, or even 5 times, that's potentially quite a bit of dry ground out there. And to give you again sort of a perspective, okay, this is about 20 acres. This actually right here is one complete island. It's about 40 acres. Okay, so that just gives you a sense of the scale maybe. So the particular place of focus in much of my work was a site I call the Nameless Site. It has the sort of formal state name of 31GA 120, but the Nameless Site. Okay, this is located in North Carolina, and it is about 2.5 miles into the swamp from the nearest western natural edge. And it's also about 2.5 miles south of Cross Canal, which I pointed out, which was an 1820 canal. So it's even interior after the canal period kicks in. So more about the interior communities. What was going on? Well, again, like I said, these are Maroons and Native Americans or Indigenous Americans, especially in that earlier period in terms of people coming in. Right? But these were all people kind of saying they've had enough for a variety of reasons, but all of them similar. They've had enough of that outside world. They're done with it. It's a very final decision these people were making individually, and maybe as groups and even families, to come into this swamp to remove themselves from that world beyond. But okay, what are they going to do once they do that? They go out there and just sit on a stump and just say, well, it's better than no. Right? People are people. So kinship groups, families maintained or formed. People procreated. People were born there. Right? They formed these communities. Right? Again, they had a very common resolve and a very common critique of that world outside. They had their similar reasons for coming in. We also want to at least think about the fact that they had this desire or built-in resistance to avoiding, right? Anything reminding or reminiscent of that outside world is built into the very fabric of the community. Okay, it's the ethos, really, right? And they're trying to develop a world, social world, right, in whatever terms they have. I'm trying to put words in their mouth, right, to take control over their lives. And again, these words, at least for me, mean a lot when I at least sit and think about it, taking real control over your life, and not in some sort of self-help manual way, right? But really, everything about your life. This is really taking everything out of other people's hands and a lot of the power they have over you, right? And putting it back in a way, or having an emergent way in ways that you find more acceptable and even delight in, perhaps, in some cases, okay? So here's an old satellite image of those interior islands. This is the one I call the Nameless Site. Not too clear, but it's the tan spots in that sea of green, the green being the swamp trees. The tan then, of course, is the sort of ground of the islands, and the trees are a little more sparse. So you can see that ground a little clearer. Now, LiDAR helps us. Okay, now this was not available when I first started. This is a somewhat recent data set. That same archipelago of islands, wherever you see that dark red, especially in larger swaths, all right, it's an island, and then even some small islands wisping around the edges. Okay, so it's quite an island complex. My best math here tells me it's between 80 and 100 acres of more or less dry ground, at least compared to the swamp around it. You can include these little ridges out here. Right, all of it's very much fair game to people that really want to be out there, right, and settle in places that aren't standing water. Close up. To the left there is the Nameless Site. I give you 3 colored dots there. Down here is the little key. The white dot represents where I worked for my dissertation. That's sort of the oldest work. The black dot is the crest or the highest point of this island. Yes, there's elevational difference. That high point is about 10 feet above swamp level. The rest, of course, less than that, going to the edges. And then blue, we call it the North Plateau. It's at, give or take, 5 feet above swamp level. Each one of these we'll have some images of, and I'll show you a little bit why they matter. And in case you're wondering, yes, this line down the middle is a 1940s canal or ditch, and there's a road next to it, and that's our nearest access point. And this is about, the path in is about 2,500 feet somewhat circuitous. All right, I won't bore you with that, but that's sort of some of the results. The survey list is summarized and say it was very promising. Very promising. All right, early on, I did basic recording of the elevations and various features of the topography of this island, the Nameless Site. All that kind of basic info was gathered. I expanded excavations. This map is a little too large a scale to be informative for this, but just so you know, we do map things, I guess, if nothing else. But those larger areas, like this and this and this, these are excavation blocks. And each of those larger areas is something I found that was particularly interesting. Okay? Oh, down there at the bottom as well. Like this. That was that large one, the largest one you saw on that map. Okay, toward the back of the excavation block, you see all those dark stains? Are they visible from out there? Okay, well, we have something here as well. Starting here, you can see the slightly darker soil. Okay, tree roots don't do that. They don't run up like this, right? Natural moles digging in the ground don't really do that. And they especially don't leave post holes in them. Okay, so something was quite interesting out here. Like, wow, right? I gotta look a little further, deeper into this. And I really, to this day, can't necessarily tell you what this is other than it is a landscape item of some kind of fence. Part of a structure, a style, I don't know. Whatever it may be. But it's definitely historic. Here's a map of that, not as fancy as they get, but it gets the point across. And this is perhaps more interesting in a way. Okay, the dark circles are posts. Okay. And you see a couple potential replacement posts here, but what the pattern we picked up on, all right, a post every 2 or 3 feet, put in a sort of a grid-like fashion. And then you have potential replacement posts coming in at later dates, sort of off-grid a bit, even here, off-grid. And then in between posts, the dark soil is where they put logs or boards, probably logs, to keep those posts from doing this kind of thing. Leaving behind that wonderful dark stained footprint, at least part of it. The whole cabin was not excavated. All right, for a couple hundred years later for us to chew on. Okay, so this is in fact a posting ground cabin, not unlike you see out still, right in the Virginia, North Carolina countryside. It's raised off the ground, my guess is about 1.5 to 2 feet. Okay. And there we were doing a little more excavation. This is sort of in-action photo for you. Always exciting. All right, so we're trying to get as many views at various angles and depths and dimensions of these features, is what we call them, as we can. And then further from that block, or at the same area, but not that block, right? Other sections of cabins. In this case, they dug a trench on the outside wall. For the outside wall, they heated up the ground so it became, the sand underneath became really almost like concrete, or concrete. Very hard, and then they put their posts and raised their structures up. And we found, in that small dissertation area, we found at least 6 different cabin footprints, just so you know, okay? And that's a 1.5 acre area, so we didn't cover by any means 100%, more like 1% is what we looked at that 1.5 acre area. What kinds of stuff, artifacts were we finding alongside those footprints and other features? Then we got lead shot. We have stone tool, arrow shaft smoother in this case, is my interpretation. We have the telltale chunks of burnt clay with impress or imprints from wattle, but the branches, right, and the wood as well that they built the cabins out of. Okay, we have animal bone, one of the few pieces of animal bone we found out there. Okay, in this case, that sharp, very distinct left straight edge might indicate a knife cut. And then we have projectile points. In this case, a style that dates to the 1700 to 1800 period, very, very well known in this region. And then here we have a very ancient, archaic period arrowhead It's been reworked on the side that the arrow's pointing to, right? So no longer being used as a projectile pointer arrowhead, but rather looks like a knife, maybe. Pretty much it is a knife, possibly a scraper, but probably a knife. It's pretty sharp. So a quick brief and summary, at least 5. Depending on how you look at it, that day was 5, I think 6 now, right? Separate hosting ground cabin footprints. Hundreds of smaller features like the post holes that we just found in, say, a small unit and couldn't expand. Probably parts of further cabins or other kinds of structures like that. The features are very different than we're used to in archaeology. It's very easy to miss them, so you train yourself to look for them. It actually seems to be a very active cultural landscape. The quantities of artifacts compared to anything from this period I've ever looked at and read about, very low. In that dissertation area, right? Clear occupation from the early 1600s up to about 1800. Okay. So here's some of this again. There's a lot of detail. I'll go on this, putting together some of the information we have from that dissertation area about dates. Okay, so we were able to ground our dating and knowledge, right, with the laboratory testing method called OSL. I'll explain more about that if anyone's interested. But after the dissertation, what drove the American University research for the most part was that upper point there, a question. What happened in 1800? You know, what happened? Why is there such little evidence, or any evidence really, of 1800 to 1860 presence when for 150 years or so or more, right? More like 200, sorry, with bad math. More like 200 years, we see that area was, we had posting ground cabins popping up all the time. Very active landscape, some in 1800. Very different use or even no use. Okay, so what we were pointing to with that question is this, something about the interior community at that island, something changed and probably very dramatic. More of the wonderful AU students excavating. Now we went to the crest, okay? To that high point. And the idea was, well, either the community just totally went away at 1800, roughly. Anything's possible, but more likely is something happened where it shrunk in size. The numbers of people went down. So if it's going to go down, if that's right or correct, where would the people that remained live on that island? Would they forego the highest elevation point on the island? The most defensible, etc.? I would think not. So, heck, why not? Let's go look at the highest point, see if we find evidence of continued occupation after 1800. Let's see what happens. Okay? So again, maps are as useful as you want to make them, but this is sort of some of the early excavation areas at the crest. We did some fancy science stuff, geophysics, and where you see green and red there, at least by geophysics interpretation, is all human activity. Right? Soil mixed up, moved around, stuff in the ground. You start getting to purple, it's a little less active, if active at all. Okay, so at least 50 excavation units we dug at the crest in a fairly small area. And we found at least 1 fire pit. We found storage and refuse pits, 7 sections of cabin footprints, a few thousand artifacts recovered in the right depths to call them historic. Okay. About 95% of the materials and artifacts we've recovered at the crest, right, are lithic and swamp, stone tools, stone flags, etc., and swamp available stuff. Okay, the remainder, that 5%, is outside world. But compare it with the dissertation area. Right? You do the math there, it's 99% swamp available, and 1% at a stretch is outside world, like that lead shot I showed you a picture of. Then on top of all that, 95% of the materials we recovered at the crest in particular are smaller than a 1/4 inch. Okay. So the screen we used to sift the dirt that captured stuff smaller than that was about the holes are about the same size you find in your screen door or your screen window. So stuff that's getting caught with those holes, right, most of that, of course, is going to fall through with holes that are 4 times as large. So the lesson there is the stuff's tiny. Okay? So here's a geophysically detected fire pit. You can see what we're up against with trying to figure out what's going on the ground. If I didn't put that dashed line in there, I'm not sure how clear it'd be to everybody, right? In fact, it's still bright. But still, right, it's a little darker area here than compared to outside. And equally important, the geophysics signature, which, let's just say the technology knows when it's found a fire pit. Let's put it that way. So that signature told us it was, and we see it here in the ground. Okay, we found, again, posts. We're excavating half of it and very early into it, about that deep into it. Right, we find a piece of quartz about the size of your thumbnail. Okay, there's another, just I'm giving you examples, right? Part of a trench, an outer wall trench here. On this side of the line, here's half of a post. The other half's unexcavated. But here's sort of the main focus of the last couple of years is a community, what we're seeing now is a community defense complex. Okay? What are we finding that makes us think it's defense? Well, quickly, it's a different architectural style than anything else we see. Second, it's on the highest point of the island, the most defensible part. Third, we're finding British gun flint chips, dozens of lead shot, several reworked tools, which can be used as weapons or self-defense, and just a few machine-cut nails. So one of the things you know in archaeology, right, is if you find nails in a typical set, you're going to find thousands of them, or at least hundreds, depending on how much you excavate. Okay? But if you dig this is a 26 by 26 square meter block. If you expose that much, which all of it, pretty much, okay, all of this way is part of that defense complex. If they were using nails for architectural purposes, we'd have found hundreds and hundreds of them. Okay? As it is, we find maybe a dozen or probably a little less. Right? And I have a slightly different interpretation of what their purpose was then, rather than architectural. Okay? Swamp available materials, again, we're finding the reworked stone tools up there. British gun flints, we'll see those in a minute, but we're also finding things like the white clay tobacco pipes, which are ubiquitous at historical sites after 1600 all the way up to the Civil War and after. Okay? Started finding those on the crest and just other areas. There's British gun flint chips. Notice I'm not saying the whole flint, just the chips. Well, that's a pretty good size in there under A. Various lead shots. We're even finding iron and copper ornaments up there on the crest. Okay? So a lot of this ends up being, long story short, from here on out, a lot of this stuff that I was just pointing out dates to roughly 1800 or later. How handy. The defense community, or the community defense structure also appears based on the artifactual evidence to be a post-1800 phenomenon. And it's on the high point of the island. Okay, last but not least, I'll get through this quickly, tell you a little more about the people or something like that. Okay, this is that North Plateau area. That's active, you can't tell at all what we're doing, other than digging. This is cleaned up for photos, of course. All right, wherever you see dark, that's cultural feature. That soil has been mixed up, one way or another. Over here is outside this feature area, which obviously is clearly scattered throughout. Well, this ends up being yet another posted ground cabin footprint. Okay, and right out here, right at the edge, okay, that's where we found a good quantity of white clay tobacco pipe fragments, a lot of the stems and a few of the bowl pieces. But inside, right, a lot of this ends up being, right, these posts, just like the one I showed you before. Circumference, diameter, whatever, of a dinner plate, maybe, typical dinner plate, spaced every couple feet in a fairly grid-like fashion. I draw your attention to this. This, by the way, is right here. Slightly deeper area dug, and that tan soil that's underneath all the darker soil is clear. So here's half of a post hole that's been excavated. And it turns out these people who built this cabin, right, lined the post with ancient ceramics, right? Particularly pieces of ceramic. So what, right? Neat, but Well, first of all, just as an archaeologist, it's kind of neat when you find fragments you can put back together. So when we pulled what we pulled out of that hole, most of it fit back together. Ends up being some of the largest, in fact, the largest artifacts we found in the swamp to date. Okay, and that one piece on the bottom is certainly close to the size of my hand. Everything we had, though, outside of that ancient ceramic, okay, Croker Landing, it's several thousand years old. Okay, everything else tells us this is a historic cabin. Okay, including that fancy chemical or laboratory tested soil, gives us a date of around 1730 plus or minus 70 years. Okay. So once again, just like the reworked stone tools, we're seeing people finding ways to use and modify and use ancient things, right, that they're finding in the same landforms they're living on, right, the Native American millennia or hundreds of years or between, anywhere in between, that they left behind. So, what changes happened? Well, obviously I'm going to tell you, right, I think a more defensive posture to the community kind of emerges, right? And why is that? Well, again, remind you that around 1800s when that canal and logging boom kicks in. The swamp is now invaded by the investors, right? The people that are trying to transform it, even partially, right, through the canal system and then the lumbering to make something out of it in terms of money or profit, wealth, etc. Okay? Meanwhile, these interior communities are dealing with that. It's inroads into their landscape and their place. Right? If it was simple as staying away from the canals, it might be things might have gone one way. But it turns out, right, that to lumber a swamp, you need to leave a certain, one given spot. You go out miles and miles and miles, depending on the situation, from your home base. So those company workers were roaming the swamp, cutting down trees, and of course, inevitably, they're going to stumble into at least the area around these kinds of communities and their settlement, their islands, and so on. So I argue in the book, it takes a little while to argue, but I'll give you the summary here. The conclusion is they developed strategic trade relations, right, with these company workers, and that is in part why we see that seemingly slight increase in outside world stuff after 1800 or so, about 4% increase. So they're trading with the company workers, right? But it's sort of strategic because it's sort of you're the one person you're trading with, and you can kind of trust them once you establish that relationship. Hopefully, your location won't be betrayed. So, where has this information and data gone, led? Okay, well, again, I don't have 10 hours, and I'm sure you're thankful for that. And it would take about that to explain all this, I suppose, but just to throw some of the keywords out there, it's uneven geographical development. It's a very popular, is the wrong word, but it's an important theoretical area of discussion across several professions today. Right, but this idea of capital, wealth, investment, etc., doesn't flow the same everywhere. It goes in intensities here and there, less intense there. I'm seeing the swamp as really one of these places that capital for a long time forgot or ignored. These people, like I said, initially took advantage of it. I've certainly made connections in the analysis and discussion with these larger scale processes like the African diaspora, Native American diasporas, and exile. Again, I can talk more about it if you're interested. And then the Marxian notion, particularly at least Marx's version of it. He invented it, so it's his version, right, of modes of production. And this is sort of a translation and part of, right, this social world that they created as a mode of production. And it's quite different than the capitalist one or the capitalistic enslavement one that they left, or the colonial one. Praxis is just another area of thought and discussion that I need to begin to try to use this data to help participate in that conversation. And then back to Marx again. Praxis is Marxian as well, but alienation in the Marxian view. I explore that at several levels, especially in the book that was mentioned. Okay, so just so you know, there's some interpretation going on here beyond just going out and finding stuff. Again, I can't tell you all the good details. Okay, but what about some of the sort of mid-level interpretation as opposed to the theory? Okay, I think we can say comfortably that between 1600 and 1860, right, thousands of people lived in the swamp at any given time. Okay, based on the islands that we know were probably there, based on some of the stuff I showed you, by extrapolating from what I've excavated about how many people may have lived on that island at any given time, and then knowing how many islands were out there, potentially in that 2,000 square mile swamp. We know that people lived permanently in the interior areas before and after 1800, so 1800 was a mark of a period of change, but they were still there. They were still there up until probably the Emancipation Proclamation. I certainly, at least in my view, verified that there are at least two different kinds of communities. Right, that interior community. I've also worked at enslaved company worker settlement locations. I just didn't have time to really get into it tonight. Okay, and we see quite a bit of contrast between the stuff we found at, say, enslaved company worker settlements and these interior settlements. Yeah. Only a few kinds of artifacts were similar between them after 1800. So those were important. Now, I made the argument based in part on other Maroons community studies, but also the archaeological evidence, right? The community, sort of the architecture of the community or the structure of it, right, formed around community or group labor and subsistence. And then I'm really fairly confident that the sort of kin or family system emerged, where all these different areas or parts of the island represented or were settled or inhabited by clusters that were defined themselves through sort of kinship or family relation, and that probably those kin groups were ranked. There was some kind of ranking, which is to say they had different ways, different powers within the community, probably based on how old they were in that particular community. I think they were heavily populated. When I'm saying community here, I'm talking about specifically these islands, like a community per island, at least the bigger ones. Probably I would erase that. They were multi-generational. Okay, and I've made that argument extensively, based again on archaeology and a little bit of comparison with other Maroon studies. This reuse, or I call it resuscitation, that's just what we do, right? We have fun with words. The resuscitation of ancient material culture, right, was very critical to these communities. It wasn't just some, what the heck, let's do it. It became a very big part of their daily existence out there in the swamp. We're finding obviously evidence of that with the reworked stone tools, and then, right, using the ceramic vessels to help keep their structures in place, etc. I think that period, 1775 to about 1810, was really the period of transformation, again with the rise of the canal companies in particular. And then all the way to the Civil War, that world changed quite a bit out there, but not to the point where it was totally transformed. And what else can I say? You know, one of the things that you notice out there at the interior site that I was focusing on there is the architecture. You can't help but miss that, at least the archaeologists here, right? And it turns out that, right, not much change in that architecture across 250 or so years that we've seen yet. Very similar styles, okay? Very similar. Post and ground, there are a couple variations on the theme out there, but basically the same kind of style and the same basic approach, right? The raised structures and so on. We have different dates ranging from the early 1600s all the way up to about 1769 for those cabins. And then the artifacts that we found on the crest help us date some of those to even later. So yeah, we're seeing this persistence of a relatively narrow, in a bad sense, but a narrow range of architectural styles across 250 or so years. And then the parallel, sort of, right? That reuse or resuscitation of ancient tools happens for 250 or so years. Okay? If people were only coming out there sporadically, you know, I'll hang out for 10 years like our example there, coming out after 13. If it was just one person or two going out there and then leaving because they couldn't make it, would you expect, I would. Would you expect that kind of continuity of style and approach to using material culture of the ancients? I don't think so. I think what you're seeing is education in action. You're seeing, right, not only the reproduction of community, but people learning how to live, how to do basic things, build a cabin. How do you make yourself a tool to use today? And we don't have any of the organic materials. They had nothing. Nothing survived out there, at least in the sands of those islands. They don't have the arrow shafts or whatever. I think baskets they would have made. That would have been like 99% probably, maybe 95, right? Best guesstimate of how, in their daily use material culture, most of it would have been organic. What we have, right, is the inorganic artifacts, but we still can say something from them, even if it's sort of pushing our focus mostly on those. Okay, very important. So I think, when you think about these communities, I gave you a sense of that sort of the kinship, sort of structuring principles and sort of system that they would have had, maybe some of the ranking of various lineages. And then you see that, right, at basic archaeological levels, we can see this sort of learned behavior, right? People learning to do, the daily tasks of life and survival. Right? I think we can go back to those kinship groups. So they can go back, right, to how people are learning. Doesn't mean only family members teach each other, but, right, we can certainly think about in more detail through archaeology, right, how these family systems and community systems and kinship systems, right, are really imprinted out there in the archaeological record. I think that's an important area of discussion, and again, I've kind of hit on it from different directions over the years, and it's something we'll continue to discuss, I'm sure. Yeah. So what about this future business? Now, outside of what we might talk about with further thinking on the subject, right, one of the things that happens in archaeology today, as you may be aware, unlike say 50 years ago or 40, it's very important in archaeology these days, right, to have something more to give than just simply a publication, right, to your peers or a book or anything like that. So, an archaeologist's approach sort of community engagement, public engagement in a variety of ways. And this project posed a variety of certain conditions in a way that sort of helps sculpt the way we approach this sort of area of the project of engagement. But the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, like I said, was certainly one of the sort of beyond the academy groups that we not only had to deal with, not in a bad way, but they own the place. But also, we did have to have a great deal of sort of conversation, even if it was sort of intermittent, about how important the cultural resources were and how important these people were. Even if we can't tell you everything about them, even on films and all, we have a very small glimpse of that world, but boy, what a glimpse, right? So for 15 or 14 or whatever years, right, this continued conversation in which I'm happy to say I've been a part anyway, not to say exclusively me, right, has helped the Fish and Wildlife Service reconsider how they approach their stewardship of this particular landscape. And this has led in more recent years to actual public interpretation of this, particularly the social history. There isn't much in this new panel, this new pavilion, public pavilion, that talks about, say, the natural resources, like many of the other public interpretation panels talk about throughout the Refuge. This one's devoted almost entirely to this social history. And I'm, again, happy to say we contributed some to that, not only the text, but also some of the images. Right now, if you're interested, for the next year, from what I understand, there's a Hampton Roads Museum exhibit, right, on resistance and slavery. And I was contacted not long ago by one of the curators to see if they could borrow some of the artifacts from the swamp and help tell the story down in those parts. Hampton Roads is near Williamsburg and Norfolk. So very much neighbors of the swamp, and we gladly worked with them to get some down there. So you can see, these are just quick images of that exhibit. I haven't been yet, sadly, but I will. Just opened, maybe 3-4 weeks ago. So yes, if you're ever looking for something to do, I hear from one of my doctoral students an absolutely amazing exhibit. She went down there a couple weeks ago. And this part of this was a project has been for many years working with some of the curators at the now new, right, National Museum of African American History and Culture in the mall. But back when it was an idea, however almost guaranteed it was to come to fruition, if that ever was the case, right? But 2010 or 9, we started working with them to develop ideas for exhibits. And right here it is. I don't know if you've been there yet, all of you, but it's quite an interesting and beautiful place. This is at night, obviously. And that's what we came up with. Yeah. A series of artifacts, most of them small, not to say the real microscopic ones that I mentioned, but pretty darn small. right? They're quite different and contrast quite a bit with all the rest of the exhibits to draw people's attention. Okay, and they give a little bit of text, right, over here. So this is sort of our foot in the door as far as this conversation goes with them. Hopefully we can develop more conversation about the swamp and these people as the exhibits at the museum grow and change and so on. Okay, I also want to remind that, you know, there is in research, whether you want it to be or not, you being the researcher, right, there are always political elements to it, aspects. You can't escape it, even if you want to. I don't, but many do. Okay, and what we do know now is that we being people paying attention to Maroons, is Maroons themselves, Maroons as a phenomenon, as people, as these sort of radical agents of their own history, right, have increasingly, for a lot of different groups, become sort of symbolic, to put it simply, right? These sort of historical figures that seem to empower people today. The phrase "find your inner Maroon" comes up from time to time, all right? It's amazing, actually, in its way. But even beyond that kind of sort of inspiration, the idea of Maroons and their real lived lives gives to certain people, what we can see in this, right, sort of precursors to many social and historical movements, at least so I would argue, right? Whether it's the various labor movements, the civil rights movement, Occupy, Black Lives Matter, it's not the same. I'm not saying everyone's going, gee, let's model ourselves after Maroons and Native Americans of the swamp, but it's part of this wider historical process of this constant resistance and constant creativity, right, when it comes to challenging the system and what it does to us and others. Okay, but there's a uniquely radical approach to life. I think we see it in its history, the fact that we even see their stuff out there in the swamp, right? And again, it's something to chew on. It doesn't hit everyone the same way, but it hits me very profoundly, right? This willful, intended separation of themselves from their known social world is quite, to me, quite remarkable. You know, just say it that way. It doesn't have to be to everybody, but it is to me. And in this case, this resistance movement, really across 250 years, didn't rely on what I call the spectacle, right? Many others do as well. Making a social spectacle of your resistance, which many do, right? Protests and so on. That's one way of radicalizing your life a bit, or making change, or whatever it might be, right? But it's very much public. It's very much in the face, right? But this is a mode of resistance and challenge, right? That was not sitting there with part of the goal is to create a sort of spectacle to get others to buy into it or come to believe it or learn from us. It was quite a different approach, and it's something we can think about. We're almost done, fear not. Okay, what can we learn from the Maroons and the Indigenous Americans of this swamp, right? Well, I think they do provide a challenge to us to rethink our 60 years and older ideas of what constitutes real progressive social transformation. I'm not assuming a politics for anyone in this room individually, right? But I'm giving you a sense of where my politics with the project lies. I do think that we can use archaeology, those of us that want to, right, to at least contribute to these more progressive social movements. But sometimes, right, we also have to get creative, like the Maroons and others did, right, with how we go about doing that. And again, nonviolent protest in particular is not a great sense that this was a violent group or world out there. They didn't go out to the outside world much, right, and do all the kinds of things Maroons and others in other places maybe have done, the raids and so on. Right? These folks went in the swamp and stayed for the most part. It was a nonviolent protest as well, which a lot of people value that, right? On the left or the progressive movements. They also, again, doesn't have to really become a spectacle. Doesn't make spectacle bad. This is another potential alternative, right? It's still trying to meet some similar goals. Okay? So some just basic ideas along those lines. We can think about what is the social and economic benefit. This is by no means new, right? But it reminds us, right, of making our own stuff. The stuff, you know, a lot of people do the food thing, the home food growing and the beer making. A lot of people are doing this kind of thing for a variety of reasons, right? But politically and socially and economic, we see what a world looks like when people are largely making their own stuff, right? Not relying on the manufacturers and the capitalists and so on, right? But taking our daily lives back from them a little bit. We have to be tired, but we can begin. And how did it last? 250 years. That's my claim anyway. Put before you, right? That we have evidence to say that this world, however imperfectly understood, lasted over 250 years. Okay? Well, I think that's one area we can continue to look at, archaeologists, if anyone's interested in that swamp or similar places, right? But by determining how it lasted or coming with some good ideas, right, it might actually influence, right, our own behaviors as we try to move forward into our future. I think, like I said, hinted at earlier, I have no doubt that the tightness of these communities, the family organization and kin organization to these communities was a major factor. The proximity even of family members to one another, even if they moved to another island when they met someone or married or whatever it may be, it's still fairly proximal. Right? And the self-reliance. Okay? Family self-reliance, proximity, right? These things are certainly fundamental to this world being out there, or this world that was out there, and I wouldn't hesitate much to say it was certainly an important part of how it lasted that long. And last but not least, this is probably more for archaeologists, but just so you know, right, this working in the swamp has helped me understand that we don't always have to go, right, where the million artifacts are and the brick foundations and the Georgian mansions and everything else, even the forts and the colonial settlements, right? Archaeologists love to focus on those. I'm not being critical, but it ends up becoming almost a bias. We don't look at these places like a Dismal swamp and think immediately, wow, very important history happened here. So looking to the marginal places where they aren't so developed and so on in our profession, right, might help us make a difference in bringing to life more of these stories that most people don't know as much about as maybe they'd like to, right, of these various groups of people across history. So there you have it. In a nutshell, I want to thank the Bowen Center, of course, for the invitation to speak tonight, and all these groups listed here. And I'm now open to questions, discussion.